Right, I thought it'd be a great chance, now it's super warm, to talk about worm fishing and when and how I like to use worms in my fishing. Because for me, on most venues, once you get to June onwards, you're talking worms. And one of the reasons that worms work so well once it gets warm is the water temperature needs to seem to get above a certain temperature, obviously, for the worms to work. So for example, Southfield here where I am today is like 3-4 foot deep, so the temperature naturally gets a bit warmer faster. I think it's probably around 12 degrees, I would say. Once the water's above that 12 degrees, the fish seem to switch on to worms. And a lot of people will say, oh, worms, aren't they, worms were poison or whatever. And I'm not a believer in that. I personally believe that once the water gets above that 12 degrees, the fish will actively look for worms, because obviously worms in their very nature are very meaty and they've got loads of things in there that the fish love. But you can imagine in winter, when the fishes have all cooled down, they're obviously cold-blooded, so they've cooled down, they don't look for those same meaty chunky meals, which is why things like meat don't work in winter as well. You're better off with, say, a coarse pellet or a maggot or corn, something a bit more watery, or something with a lot less feed value than a worm or meat. So that's the first thing I would look for. At Southfield, it comes into its own probably like May time, but now we're in June, it's warm. All the venues that you go into, worms will work. Now, how much worm and how you prepare your worm and how you use your worm is how you're going to get the best out of it. So first of all, make sure you've got your worms. I like to clean my worms off and then just leave them in the tub to gather. Now you can see there that sort of like bigger bits of debris have gathered. All I did was put those on a riddle, give them a good shake and get all the fine soil off. So then I can literally just push this to the side, get my clump of worms, and then I'm chopping neat worms. All right, that's very important. You don't want all that really fine soil that comes with worms in your worms when you chop it, because then you're not feeding worms, you're feeding soil and worms, and that's totally different. You can't regulate it the same. So I tend to maximum half fill the pot. You can see there I've got about a third in there, so just going to give them a good chop. Now, how to chop your worms is important. When I'm fishing for bream, sometimes I like a nice big coarse chop. Real big bits of feed, almost like some whole wormy bits. Carp love it like that as well. So often I will just literally show the scissors to the worms. I've got these big coarse bits of worm that I could almost feed just to control the peg a little bit more, just so he doesn't get carried away with little fish. Southfield is notorious for smaller fish coming in later on, and if you feed lots of fine bits of worms, you can attract small fish into your peg. Whereas if you chop your worms a bit coarser and sit a little bit more patient and almost feed them as individual bits, that's how you would target bream. Like Ferry Meadows, I like to introduce my worms like that as well. But when I'm looking to attract fish and almost just lay the bait worms down as almost like a taster, get them hunting around, almost like micro pellets if you like, I like to chop the worm nice and fine, so you'll find no pieces in there bigger than, say, a centimetre. That's what I'm looking for. And if I can see a centimetre piece, I'll just give it another little blast. Look, really fine bits of worm. So even if I go that much worm, look at actually how many different pieces there are on my finger there. Probably nearly 20 different pieces of worm. And obviously that's a lot of food for fish to eat. It holds them in the peg a lot longer. They're sort of milling around looking for pieces of worm. Allows little fish to eat a few pieces and still leave worm in your peg. So that can be a great way of doing it. I then get my sieve, got my little sieve here, and I literally just empty that worm out onto the sieve. Now, I love the juice that comes with worm, but I don't like it in excess. So these sieves have got a nice fine, you can actually see the liquid sort of holds in it a little bit and just drips out slowly. So what it means is the worms won't all be totally covered in liquid, but they've still got loads of juice in them, which is obviously very attractive to the fish. So I'm almost getting like a best of both worlds there. I see a big piece, it gets chopped up. All right, and I keep that here on my side tray. So I've basically got the worms on my side tray, and then I've got my ground bait. Super Feeder sweet fish meal for me today. Great ground bait to go with worms. And when you're feeding the worms, you've got to think about how you want to introduce them into your feeder. So first of all, and one of my favourite ways of introducing worms, I'm going to put a tiny little piece of worm on the hook here, because I'm going to have a cast out while you guys are here. Why wouldn't I? So just going to put a tiny piece of worm on the hook to mimic the hook bait. And then what I like to do is like get a blob of worms, put it into my ground bait. Now I've mixed the ground bait almost like, I'm just going to say a medium, not overly dry, not overly wet. And then because I'm using a cage style feeder, just turn that ground bait over in your fingers on the spot. And what you're left with is almost the ground bait just clagging the worms together a little bit, right? And that means when I load it into the feeder and I scoop it into the feeder, it's all, I can almost like keep it nicely mixed amongst the feeder. So you can see there's bits of worms in there, but it doesn't come popping out the side. It's all held in the feeder nicely, almost like, I think somebody once said fettled in, and I think that's a great description, almost just mixed in amongst the bait. And it means that when it comes out of the feeder, lovely, when it comes out of the feeder, then that's when all the bait will start to break down and release into the peg, and the ground bait's obviously taken on the juices. Now the other way of which I like to do it, oh there's one here, is with my window feeder. Now the window feeder is different. This is when I wouldn't look to mix it in with the ground bait. A window feeder is my opportunity to almost introduce the worms in its neat form. So I might get the worms, drop them in the bait like this so I can keep them nice and neat. That means I can regulate exactly how much I feed. I mean, that's quite a lot of worm there, so take a bit out. And then all I would literally do is scoop those neat worms into the feeder and then just scoop the ground bait on top. And obviously this sort of ground bait, this Super Feeder sweet fish meal just goes in lovely because I can just tap it gently there, look, on the top. And then effectively what that's doing is all my ground bait there is neat, that can melt out, it can use all the attraction of ground bait, and then it releases a neat parcel of worms at the end. But obviously the fish can get the heads down and eat. And it's different to having it mixed through your ground bait, because effectively when it comes out, it does give a bigger fish an opportunity to almost eat it in one go, rather than sort of stay there and pick bits off. It can actually pick your bait up because it's a concentrated lump. So what I tend to look for is signs and indications, kind of on there, signs and indications that tell me that worms are working. So the best way to do that is to start putting your, as a vicious bite, oh, just come off, little hybrid or something that was, is to start putting the worms through your feeder from the start, but not loads, just little bits of worm. Maybe start with maggot on the hook, something like that, and then you want to put worm onto the hook. Now what you'll find is, if worm is what the fish really want to eat on that day, that piece of worm looks okay. If worms are really what the fish want to eat on that day, you'll start getting bites a little bit quicker, you'll start getting bites a little bit more aggressively, and because of that, it gives you the confidence to feed a little bit more worm. And obviously when the day starts, the water's a little bit cooler, it then heats up a little bit through the day as well, and the fish almost seem to turn on to the worm as it goes. So if you go out with a worm on the hook and you don't get any bites from fish, yet you were getting a few bites on maggot, you know you can ease off the worm and just keep introducing small little taster amounts. But if you chuck out like I did there with a worm on the hook and I had a big aggressive bite, and there's obviously signs, there was indications, there's fish in the peg, that's when you can start being more aggressive with the worm and introducing it like I've shown you there in those two different ways. So when you're next out feeder fishing, remember how good worms are, and hopefully these bits of advice will help you use them properly when you're on the bank.